Welcome back, my fellow Python programmers, to a brand new video, and in this one we're going to be looking at classes in Python. So if at any point you feel that you're enjoying the contents of this video, make sure to slap that like button and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first of all, we define a class that is called movie. This class is a blueprint for creating movie objects, and the class is the simplest form of that. By convention, whenever we're creating a class, the name of that class has to be in the uppercase. So we've seen that variables are in the lowercase, functions are in the lowercase. Now finally we can use the uppercase to define a class. And notice that there are no parentheses in the class definition, unlike functions, because we're creating this class from scratch. Later on, we're going to be adding parentheses when we want to create inheritance from one class to the next. And finally, we have the pass right here, because you cannot just create a class and not have anything in there. So just like functions, just like if statements, we have to add something, and I added this pass. This is whenever you don't want to add anything, and if I right click and I run, as you can see, we get this output, which is basically nothing. Okay, so in here we've added the init method, which is a special method in Python that runs automatically when we create a new instance, and we'll see what this instance means later on. Basically, it's when we create a new movie object. A function that is part of a class is called a method. So we've seen functions before, but we define functions inside of classes and then we call them methods. Now, some places you'll find that people use functions and methods interchangeably. Don't worry, you can use them however you want, it doesn't matter. So everything you've learned about function applies into methods as well. Alright, so this is an instance of a class, and this instance is just a variable that is of type movie. And notice what we've provided it with. We've provided the title, and this is something that we haven't talked about, don't worry, we're going to go over these. We've provided the title, that is Inception. We've provided the director, that is Christopher Nolan. So this is exactly the same thing as we've done with functions. We are sending in parameters. And finally, we have the release year, that is 2010. So if I right click and I run, you'll notice that we don't get anything. But let me show you, if we simply print out hello inside of here, and I want to show you how this is called automatically. So notice right here, I didn't call the init anywhere. I simply created an instance of a class or an object of type movie, and when I right click and I run, you can see that hello is called or printed out, which means that this init was called automatically. So this is just for testing. I'm going to comment it out. Now let's take a look at what's inside of this init method. So first of all, as you can see, it takes in 4 parameters: the title, director, release year, and also the self. So what is this self? This self is a parameter that is required in the method definition. So every single method that you create in movie, we'll see later on that there are some exceptions, but every single method that you create needs to have this self parameter. And it always must come first, so it has to always be before the other parameters. And the self right here refers to the instance itself. So the self right here refers to my movie. So for example, when I add a second movie, and now when I right click and I run, now when I send in this information to the init, the self right here refers to my movie number 2. So my movie number 2 has a title of Pulp Fiction, but my movie number 1, you notice right here self.title, my movie number 1, or just my movie, has a title of Inception. So the self refers to the instance itself. So to demonstrate this further, I'm going to actually print out the title of something. Okay, so as you can see right here, what I did is I actually accessed this title and this title of movie number 2 and the director of movie number 2. And I printed them out. So if we right click and run, you can see that for my movie, which is movie number 1, I have Inception as the title. My movie 2 as the title I have Pulp Fiction, etc, etc. So whenever we are calling the init, whenever we're creating an instance, we are calling the init and we're sending in the parameter. And on this line, and of course the same happens right here, we're sending in the self, which is my movie. We're sending in the title, which is Inception. We're sending in director, which is Christopher Nolan, etc. And then on this line, we take the value associated with the parameter title and we assign it to the variable title. So this, if we double click on it, you can see that it refers to this title right here, which is the parameter. But when we double click on this one, you'll notice that it refers to the variable title associated with the instance that is being created, which is referred to as the self. So again, this is a concept that is very unfamiliar to beginners with object-oriented programming. This is why I'm going over it again and again. This is the instance that we've created. When we call the movie, the init is automatically called, and it takes in the title, director, release year. So these are the three parameters that we provided, but it also takes in the self, which is actually my movie. So now this my movie is the self right here, and the dot title refers to the title that was sent to it. And by the way, these variables right here, the title, director, and release year, remember, they are different than these because these are the parameters. These are the actual variables associated with the instance. These are called attributes. These attributes can be accessed using the dot notations as we've done right here. Okay, so now we've added two more methods to our movies, or to our movie class. We've displayed the information, which takes in the or accesses the title of the self. And notice, and something that you've probably noticed as you're writing this code, when you type in display or def display and then hit tab to autocomplete, or whatever you do, just hit space when you open up the parentheses and hit tab or whatever, you'll notice that the self is added automatically. Why? Because when we call this method mymovie.displayInfo, the display info also sends in the self that refers to my movie. This is how we know that we're displaying the information of my movie that has Inception attribute associated with it. So now when I right click and I run, you'll notice that again right here we get the following output, which is Inception, directed by Christopher Nolan and released in 2010. So as you can see, this is what it does right here. It also accesses the director and the release year, obviously. Now we have another method right here that is the isClassic, and it does the same thing. It takes in the self parameter, and basically what it does is it takes 2024, which is the year when I'm recording this video, minus the self.release year, so at what year it was released, and if it's over 30, then it returns true. So basically this either returns true or false, where it checks if it's a classic movie or not. And so right here you can see that movie 2 .isClassic returns false. Why? Because movie 2 was released in 1994, and you can see that it's just not more than 30. It's equal to 30, but it's not greater than 30, and that was the problem. Now, if I change this to maybe 1993, which is of course false, but I just want to test it out, you can see that I indeed get true. I'll change it back because I don't want to mess with Quentin Tarantino. Anyway, let's try to display movie number 2. So I duplicate this using Ctrl D, and instead of movie 1, I'm going to choose movie 2, and when I right click and I run, you can see that I get Pulp Fiction, directed by Quentin Tarantino and released in 1994. So even though we're calling the same method that is display info, notice it also tells us where we've used it. If you're using a different IDE, this might not be present. If you're using PyCharm, this should be there. And basically what happens is that because we're sending in the self parameter, which refers to the instance, which in this case is movie 1, in this case it's my movie 2, once the self is sent in, then it knows that when I access the title, so right here, let's stay on line 24, when we say mymovie.displayInfo, the self is my movie, and the self has the self, which is my movie, has a title of Inception. Right here on line 25, the self is my movie 2, and my movie 2 has the title of Pulp Fiction. So this is how object-oriented programming works. All right. Congratulations, my fellow Python programmers, you finally understood object-oriented programming. This is the bedrock of working with Python and with almost any other language, because Java, JavaScript, everything that you see in programming is object-oriented programming. Every single modern C++, etc. is object-oriented programming. This is very important. This is why it took me so long to explain and re-explain, because beginner students always have a problem with understanding object-oriented programming. But now you know how it works. Now we're going to look deeper into working with classes and working with attributes. So let's go ahead and continue on. Alright, so what I did right here is I simply copied the class from the previous file. I don't want to write it again from scratch. And to make this class more interesting, we're going to add a new attribute that is going to be the views count. And notice that this time when Python calls the init method to create a new instance, it stores the title, director, and the release year values as attributes like it did in the previous example, but this time we don't provide it with the view count. Instead, what Python does is it creates a new attribute that is called the view count, and it sets its initial value to 0. So we don't provide the view count whenever we're creating a movie, but whenever a movie is created, a new attribute that is the view count is created. So let's create a method that allows us to display the views and create an instance. Okay, so we've made a new instance of a class movie. Oh, before that, we also created the check views, and basically, again, this method takes in the self, and then accesses the title, and then accesses the view count. We've created an instance of the class movie. This time we're looking at Shawshank Redemption, another amazing movie. In 1994 was a great year for movies. Then we displayed the info, and then we checked the views. So now when I right click and I run, you can see that the Shawshank Redemption was directed by Frank Darabont and released in 1994. And it has 0 views. Now let's look at how we can modify this value. So as you can see right here, we also use the dot notation to access the view count of our movie 1. And this time, instead of simply displaying it like we've done right here, where we displayed the director, we actually modified the view count. So when I right click and I run, as you can see right here, after a few people watched this movie, now when we check the views, we get 20. But we can also modify the value of an attribute through a method. Okay, so I created a new method right here instead of the movie class, and this time this method doesn't only take the self, it also has the parameter views. And basically what it does is it accesses the view count of the instance sent in, which is the self, and it sets it to the views that was sent to it. Then after even more people watched the movie, I said movie1.update the views and set it to 30, and then I want to check the views. So when I right click and I run, we get, after even more people watched the movie, the Shawshank Redemption has 30 views. But this function or method doesn't only have to set the views, we can give it additional work. Alright, so basically what I did in here is I added some functionality or some additional work to the update views method. Now when the views are sent in, first we check if the views that that we receive to update are greater than the current views. If they are, then we set the views. If they're not, then we say that the views don't just disappear, because of course once you watch a movie you cannot unwatch it, so the number of views can only go up, they can never go down. So we check if the views that we're trying to update are greater than the current views, and then we tested it out. So we try to update the views and make it 10 instead of what they already were, which is 30 at this point. And now when we right click and we run, as you can see, views don't disappear even after more people, which is kind of a lie. So this Shawshank Redemption stays at 30 views. And as you can see, this is the essence and the power of working with object-oriented programming. We were able to make sure that the views don't get updated unless they are greater than the previous view count, without having to change everything. This automatically is applied to all the other objects. If I have movie 304 and I try to remove the views or set a lower view count, this will work on it as well. So we were able to fix this across all the instances possible for the movie with a single update on a single method. And this is where the power of object-oriented programming comes in. Now let's make a method that increments the views by a certain amount. Okay, so as you can see right here, this increment views also takes in the views add, and it simply adds these views to it. Now, of course, in here we need to make sure that the views to add are positive and they're not negative, etc. But this is not the goal. The goal in here is just to show you how we can actually increment an attribute, not just set it. So again, right here, what I did is, and I forgot to make it increment the views. So right here, after even more people watch the movie.1.increment, and we increment it by 200. So what do you think the answer is going to be? 200 plus 30 is 230. And we could have also done this. So I'm going to duplicate this, comment this one out, and instead what I could have done is I could have accessed the view counts and said plus equal 200, and the output or the result would have been the same. And if you're not sure, let's just make it 300 so you're convinced that this also works. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, again, once I was watching a video of mine and I was skipping through the chapters, and every single time I say, okay, my fellow Python programmers or whatever. I think this is a staple going forward. Anyway, okay, ladies and gentlemen, congratulations, you've understood how attributes work, you've seen how we can update them, how we can set them, how we can display them, how we can add different methods that have different functionalities, and you're starting to see the power of working with object-oriented programming. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. So far, everything or all the classes that we've created were created from scratch. But now we're going to look at how we can make a class not from scratch, but that has already inherited, because we're going to be looking at inheritance, that has already inherited some functionalities and attributes from a previously created class. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so we start with the movie class just like it was before. Then we've created the documentary class that inherits from movie. And how did we know that it inherits from the movie? First of all, the name of the parent class must be included in parentheses in the definition of a child class. Yes, the child class is the class that inherits, and the parent class is the class that gives the inheritance. Next, we have the init method that takes in the information required to make the movie instance. Notice right here, so this is the init of the documentary, and it still takes in the same parameters as the movie. Also notice that we have this real weird circle right here. Two weird circles actually. But then inside of this init, we also have this super right here, and this function is a special function that allows you to call the method from the parent class. So this line tells Python to call the init method from the movie, which gives a documentary instance all of its attributes. Again, what happens in here? The init when we create an instance of the documentary, this init is called, and then the super calls the init of, you can see even when I double click on it, it calls the init of the movie and sets the attribute. So now the documentary has a title, director, release year, and it will also have its own view count. So when I right click and I run, oh, and by the way, in here we also have the method. We can call the method of the parent class on the my documentary. So when I right click and I run, you'll see that I have the social dilemma directed by Jeff Orlowski and released in 2020. So we can even use the methods that we've inherited. Let's try it out on a different method. So as you can see right here, we've already seen it on the display info, but then what I did is I checked the views, I incremented the views, and then I checked the views again, and notice that my documentary class doesn't have these methods on it. It simply uses the method that are from the parent class. So when I right click and I run, boom, there we go. We can see that the views were 0. Now there's 369. Nice. I swear to you, if you look at your keyboard, you can see that you have 3, 6, and 9 right above each other on the keyboard, and I just typed in 3 randomly. And I got this number. Anyway, something that's very important is that we have this blue circle right here. If you hover over it, it says that this is overridden in documentary. And this is something that we will look at later on when we override a method. Or actually right now we're going to look at it. But we also have this other circle when we hover over it is subclassed by documentary. And sometimes these are called a subclass and a superclass. Sometimes they're called child and parent. Sometimes they are just referred to as inheritance. So keep in mind, you're going to see a lot of those, but the idea is the same. This is the parent class, the movie, and this is the child class. And basically the child class inherits all the attributes and all the methods, but it can also make modifications. So let's see how we can begin to define attributes and methods that are specific to documentary. Okay, so let's now look at what we've done. First of all, we've added an extra parameter right here to the init. And by the way, two things that I forgot to mention, and I apologize for this. First of all, this init is called a constructor. Sometimes you will see this, it's called a constructor. Now, I've started to notice that throughout the years, people are using the word constructor less and less, but if you ever come across it, or you're searching for something, the init is the constructor of any class. We've added an extra parameter, and then we've set this subject. So every documentary has to have some kind of subject, right? Different than a movie. Sometimes a movie could have no subject at all, but a documentary has to have one. I'm not sure about that. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm just saying. Then also something very important, and this is something that you've probably already seen, is that between a class and another class, and between the class and the main code body, there should be two blank lines, just like we've seen with functions. This is probably something that you've already seen. Also, I forgot to mention, documentary starts with a capital D because this is the naming convention when we are working with classes. Next, we defined another method right here, that is the display subject. So we return the self.title is a documentary about the self.subject, and we call this method right here. So this is unique to the documentary instances. So if we have a movie right here, like for example, I'm just going to copy the movie from here. And if we have the movie, notice that if I try to, and add an extra space, if I try to say movie1.display, I don't get the display subject. If I try to force it right here, you can see that we get a highlight because this is an unresolved attribute. We don't have an attribute display subject. So now every single method that is part of the documentary cannot be associated with the movie instances. So a movie cannot display the subject, but a documentary can, for example, update its views. So this is the privilege of having a child class. So now when I right click and I run, you can see that we have... Alright, so we can see that we have the social dilemma, 0 views, yada yada. The social dilemma is a documentary about social media. Now let's look at overriding methods from parents, even though we've seen it with the constructor that is the init, but we're going to take a deeper dive. Okay, so as you can see right here, we've created a method that has the exact same name that is in the parent class, and already we have this little circle right here with an up arrow. Before, it was a white down arrow. Now we have one in here as well. So if we hover over, you can see that is overridden in the documentary. If we hover over this one, you can see overrides method in the movie. So you can override any method from the parent class that does not fit what you're trying to model with a child class. Like for example, right here, when we're displaying the information about the documentary, we would like to also display the subject. And to do this, you define a method in the child class with the same name as the method you want to override in the parent class, and Python will disregard the parent class method and only pay attention to the method you've defined in the child class. So now when I display the, when I display the information, notice when I double click on my documentary, when it's used on my documentary, it will use the display info of the class documentary and not the display info. Where is it? Right here, you can see that it's not highlighted, not the display info of the movie. So when I right click and I run, you can see that right here in the display info, which was the first one, we added the subject, while on the movie it wasn't there before. If you remember, we did not have the subject displayed when we did not have the display info, and you can even test it out. So if I Ctrl// to comment these out, right click and run, that now you can see, first of all, when I double click on display info, this display info is highlighted in the movie class, and when I right clicked and run, I didn't have a subject, but now, again, Ctrl// again to uncomment them, right click and run, and you can see that now subject is added. And finally, let's go ahead and look at composition. Okay, so welcome to composition. It's, if you want to call it, the brother or the sister or whatever, the sibling of inheritance. Basically, composition in object-oriented programming is a design principle where objects are composed. This is where composition comes from, composed using references to other objects, like in here, where we have an object that we've created of type director, and it's part of another object that is the movie. Right here, when we were working with inheritance, this was called a is-a relationship. So the documentary is a movie, but the composition is a has-a relationship, where the movie has a director. So that's the difference. Inheritance is a, documentary is a movie, composition has a, the movie has a director. So the director is a class that we've created. Each director has a name and nationality. We display the information of that director, and the director right here, as you can see, is now an instance, and I actually added a comment, is now an instance of the class director. So whenever we create a movie or instance of a movie, we do that. So now when we right click and run, you can see that social dilemma, and we have a big problem in here. So if we come back, we can see that what we did is we said directed by the self director, and this is something that I didn't notice. So now Notice at this output, so it's social dilemma directed by, and we get this weird object. It's because we are referencing an object, and this is something that I forgot to do because I just copied it. This is the problem with copying. This is why I don't like it when we copy code, but we make an exception because we are lazy sometimes. So right here I'll hit enter. This is exactly the same. So release, this is the release here, and then we have the director's info. And something maybe that I didn't mention and a lot of you were confused, this info equals super.display. This is because I thought, well, we've already covered super with the init, but maybe you were like, oh, what's this super doing in here? Well, the super.display info means that we're calling the display info, and whenever in doubt, just double click and look what it references. So the super.display info means that we're calling the parents display info method, which is this display info. So first of all, we get all of the information from the movie, and then we simply add the subject to it after we print out the movie. I hope that was clear. Sometimes I just move on with things. I just wanted to come back and re-explain it because we basically do the same in here, but it's a bit different where we don't use the super, but instead what we do is we access the director and then we access the display movie of that director. So again, double click, what's highlighted in here, this is highlighted, but also this one is highlighted. So even though this one is also highlighted, it says that it's dynamic. So there we go. Oh, that was a big one. Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations on learning object-oriented programming. I mean, now you have a skill set that is indispensable when it comes to working with Python or any other language. This is something that I always tell students. If you can master object-oriented programming, you can learn any other object-oriented language in a matter of weeks. It's just about learning the syntax. Java, C++, C#, all the doors are open to you now because you know object-oriented programming. But we're not done yet because you need to test out your knowledge in the things that we've learned. So it's time for a mini project and a challenge. Let's go ahead and look at what that is. Okay, so library but with OOP this time. Sounds familiar, right? This is because I'm reusing a challenge from the previous video, but this time we are working with object-oriented programming. So congrats, you have been hired to create an application that handles various libraries and book needs. Deja vu. First of all, you'll need to define a class book. The constructor takes in a title, author, SIB or ISBN, I believe this should be ISBN, whatever it is, it's just the standard number for every single book, and the copies or the number of copies that this book has sold. It also has two methods, one that displays all the attributes and one that updates the copies. Next, you'll need to make 3 books. The information of these books will be in the description, or you can add your own that displays a book, and also you need to display the book 3 info after you've made these 3 books. Next, you'll need to make modifications to book number 3 in 2 different ways and display the information after each time. Define the member class that takes in the name and the ID of a said member that would like to maybe get a book, and has an extra attribute that is a list of books. So it doesn't take in the list, this list, it just has that extra attribute. It has 2 methods, one that appends the list of books and the other one that returns a certain book. So this time an attribute can also be a list. Next, you'll need to make 2 members and let each borrow and return some books. So far you only have 3 books, so you'll have to try to have one member borrow 2 books and then return 1 and then display the information and so on and so forth. Next, you'll need to define a class special edition book that inherits from the book class. It calls the super in it and adds bonus content, which is the attribute. So the bonus content is the attribute, and a method that overrides display info does the same thing but adds the special content. So the display info will be overridden just like we've done, so this should be pretty easy. And finally, add a special book and display that special book info. And if you want, you can also try to borrow that special book, see what happens, any changes. Pause the video right now and go do the challenge. Okay, so as you can see, we've created the class book, takes in the title, author, ISBN, not SIBN. Sorry for that. Again, not professional at books. I'm just good at Python coding. ISBN and the copies, and then we set all four attributes. Next, we display all of the information. I chose to do it like this with a \n that creates a new line and \t that adds a tab. And finally, we update the copies by sending in the change and then incrementing the copies by that change. Okay, and now we made these three books. I'm going to link them at the bottom. Of course, the ISBN numbers are just different numbers. We have the name, the director, the author, the ISBN, and the number of copies that we have at this library. Did I say the numbers of copies sold maybe previously? What I meant is in the library, we have the following copies. We only have these copies. So 1984, amazing book. How to Kill a Mockingbird, never read it. The Great Gatsby, never read it. But I heard that these are good books. Okay, so this is the members class. Again, the constructor right here with the init, the name, and the member ID. We set the attributes and then we initialize this list of borrowed books. Now, some of you might have been confused, and what I recommend that you do is if you didn't know how to create the member and you were stuck in the challenge, once you've seen the member, pause the video and try to do this again. After we've created this borrowed books, and by the way, this should be books borrowed, not book borrowed, because it's a list. So what I can do is double click, hold Ctrl R. You can see that now I can change it, and I'm going to copy and paste it and set it to books. So with an S, and I say replace all, and now as you can see. So again, let's do this again, because some of you were like, oh, what the heck just happened? Double click, Ctrl R. Now, right here, I can change this to Michael if I want. Replace all. There we go. Now all of them are Michael. Ctrl R and saves you a hell of a lot of time. So again, replace all. Oh, I have to copy this, set it right here, and then replace all. And now we have books borrowed. Okay, so continue on. First of all, we check if we have enough copies. So remember, every single book has a number of copies, and if we have more than 0, then you can of course borrow a book, and the way you do this is by appending and also by updating the copies. And some of you in here might have thought, well, what I did is I simply set it to the change or set it to a certain number. And this is where you have to maybe come back and change this. Even though I didn't tell you, you don't have to do this. It wasn't specified in the challenge, but this is how I decided to do it. So basically we append to the borrowed books and then we update the copies. And finally, if there are no copies, we don't have the book title. We tell them, and then finally we can also return the book but first we need to check if that person actually has borrowed a certain book. I mean, if he did, we remove the title and then we update the book. And by the way, this is also a composition if you haven't noticed, because this is a list of books and we have books right here. So this is also composition. Keep that in mind. So even though it's the member has a list of books, and these books are defined right here. Oh, and my apologies, I forgot to display book number 3. So I'm going to say book number 3. Oh, actually, I'm gonna print out book number 3 dot display info, and I apologize for that. I skipped a part of the challenge. As you can see, these are all displayed very properly. Then I'm going to make some modifications. And right here, as you can see, I've added 6 copies. When I right click and I run, I have now 10 copies instead of 4. And of course, we said that there should be 2 different ways. So I'm going to duplicate this, comment it out, and then instead I'm going to say book 3 dot copies, and then I'm going to say plus equal 9. and then right click and run, and as you can see 4 plus 9 is 13. So apologies for that, and I'm also going to comment these out because I don't want a lot of things to clutter. So let's continue on with the challenge right here. Okay, so what I did in here is I displayed book number 1 and book number 2, and then I borrowed book number 1 by member number 1 and book number 2 by member number 2, and then I displayed the info afterwards. So what should happen is we should see a number of copies before the borrowing, and we should see a number of copies after the borrowing, or one less after the borrowing. So when I right click and I run, I get an error. Excellent, because book has no attribute title. So where is that? I simply click right here and I go to where I said title, and I meant to say title. So when I right click and I run, there we go. So after borrowing, before borrowing, we had 5 copies of George Orwell and 3 copies of To Kill a Mockingbird, and after borrowing we have 4 copies instead of 5, and we have 2 instead of 3. So this works. Let's see if the return works. Okay, so as you can see right here, what we did is we first of all returned book number 1 from member number 1, returned book number 2 from member number 1. Keep in mind, they did not borrow that book, I think, but let's see. Our program should tell us that. And finally, the member number 2 returned book number 2, and then we printed out all of the information. So when I right click and I run, as you can see right here, sorry Alice, you haven't actually borrowed 1984. Why? Because right here. But it also tells us that Alice did not borrow How to Kill a Mockingbird, which is not correct. So there is something wrong in here. Okay, I just noticed my mistake. So right here again, we're back with the title. Basically remove book. Just like that, we simply remove that actual book. And now if I right click and I run, there we go, we still have a mistake right here. Okay, first of all, I noticed that this should be return book. And there we go, it does not work. But at least now it does not work properly. So let's see where we made a mistake. Fellow Python programmers, I'm so sorry for this, but this is why I like to keep the mistakes that I made. So, when I borrow a book, I append it, not with the book, I appended it with the title. And this is a great way for us to look at the mistakes that even your instructor can sometimes have. I like to keep those, even though maybe it makes me look bad, but I just want you to know that everyone makes mistakes. So basically what was happening is we were appending it not with the actual book object, we were appending it with the book title, and that is why we were not able to find it for Alice or Bob. A lot of mistakes were made. I'm very tired. This is a very long video. And now when I right click and I run, hopefully, as you can see, yes, finally it works, because we were able to return To Kill a Mockingbird, because now we had 2 copies, now we have 3, and we were able to return 1984 because there was 4 and now there's 5. And finally, Alice did not borrow How to Kill a Mockingbird, she only borrowed book number 1, which is 1984, so everything works well. Okay, so as you can see right here, what's the problem? Okay, it's special book. So I have a special book in here that I created, that is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, has an ISBN, has 5, and takes in exclusive illustrations, because I created a special edition book right here. And again, does exactly the same thing, takes in the same parameters as does the book class right here, except for it adds the bonus content. It calls the super constructor, which is the init in the parent class. Again, it inherits from book because it has these parentheses right here, and it also sets the bonus content. Finally, it displays all the information by first calling the super display info and then adding the special content. So now when I right click and I run, I get an error again because I simply said to special books. What I meant to say is display info. Right click and run. I need to finish this video right now because I am so tired. Ladies and gentlemen, did you like that transition? Congratulations, my fellow Python programmers. My battery is running very low. All that I have to say, please like the video if you enjoyed the content. In the next one, we're going to be looking at exceptions and file reading and writing. So you have to click on this video right here. My camera's about to die. It's like blinking. It's like, please end this video now. So click on this next video, like it, whatever you want to do. See you next time. Thank you so much.